Are you ready to help release the shame, end the shame and stigma around what it means to be a survivor of sexual trauma? Well, this is the video for you. Thank you for joining me. I'm Peggy Oliveira, and I'm doing this video because it's very relevant, but it's also Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And unfortunately, there is still much work to be done when it comes to raising awareness around sexual assault and abuse. So I talk about shame a lot. And the reason that I talk about it a lot is because it is really, generally speaking, the most destructive part or experience that we are left with as a survivor of sexual trauma, as a child or as an adult. It's so profound. And because it's shame, we don't talk about it. Not in any real meaningful way anyway. And shame breeds in silence and secrecy. It does, and it's just, it becomes this like boulder that you're carrying around that has never been yours. And it's beyond time that we release the shame, that as a society, we understand the ways in which survivors are shamed. And this video isn't going to do all of that, but it's just something to consider. It's something to maybe help start a conversation, because part of how we end the shame and stigma of what it means to be a survivor of sexual abuse or assault is by talking about it, normalizing the reality that it happens, not that it happens, not normalizing sexual abuse and assault, but normalizing the reality of it, normalizing having conversations about it, so that when somebody is abused or when somebody is struggling, it can feel somewhat natural, still vulnerable, but still natural to be able to talk about it and not fear so much judgment, not feel so much shame around it. And that only happens by talking, by sharing, by being willing to have those kinds of conversations. And much of the time, they start within us. They have to start there, actually, because whether you're a survivor or not, our sense of being uncomfortable with not wanting to talk about it comes from our own feelings about it, and whether that's shame or fear, because for a lot of people, talking about it makes it real, and a lot of people don't want to face that fact. But the more that we talk about it, so again, normalizing conversations around it, people will get more accustomed to having those kinds of conversations. And just like there was a time that nobody would talk about having cancer, right? Like there was a time that people didn't want to talk about cancer because there was shame around that, which there shouldn't be shame there either. But people felt shame, they felt bad, they didn't want people feeling sorry for them. So obviously very different things, but some similarities there. People didn't know how to respond when somebody shared that they had cancer, because what do you say and what do you do, and you can't fix it and all of that. So for people on both sides of it, the person who's been abused or assaulted and the person who might be just somebody who is willing to have the conversations, be a supportive person for somebody who is a survivor, the more we have those conversations, the easier it becomes the less shame and stigma there is, and the more open we are in talking about all of it, in all reality, the less likely, or the less, in a sense, the less ability there is for somebody to perpetrate. Now, it doesn't mean that it's going to keep people from perpetrating and that it's never going to happen again. But when people are able to talk about it, if somebody is able to feel comfortable enough because they don't feel shame if they are abused or assaulted as a child or an adult, if they're not holding that shame and the fear that goes along with that, then they're much more likely to say something. It's still going to be challenging, especially for a child. But part of the reason that children or even adults don't say anything is because they don't hear people talking about it. And whenever something is said about it, or they do overhear something about it, it's not usually positive in regards to the survivor. Why didn't they come forward sooner? Why didn't they say no? Why didn't they tell somebody? Why didn't they go to the police? Why didn't they get help? If you're a survivor, you've probably heard some of those things, even if not directed specifically towards you. And all of that adds to the shame. So if we were able to eradicate that by having conversations, then if a child is abused, like particularly by maybe a teacher or a coach or a neighbor or something like that, within the family, it's a little bit more challenging. But if a child were abused by somebody, whether that child is just 4 years old or 14 years old, if the shame is not there because there's a willingness to talk about it, and people talked about how it can feel when somebody abuses you that first time and how it makes you doubt yourself and feel shame and all of that, then they're going to know what's happening. They're not going to interpret what they're experiencing and feeling as being bad or wrong or responsible. And so if people come forward, even if it's with a friend or a parent, I'm not talking specifically about the police, but if people began to feel safe enough to come forward to share their struggle even, then when it happens, people would start talking about it much more quickly. And again, silence and secrecy breeds shame. Well, if we are not holding it as a secret and we're not silent about it, and we as a society are not silent about it, then there isn't as much ability for shame to take root. Just like now, when somebody has cancer, people talk about it. There are huge campaigns to raise awareness and money for people who are diagnosed with cancer, all forms or many forms of cancer. We immediately want to support people. We don't blame them, but there was a time that people were questioned. And there are actually a lot of similarities here. They were questioned because cancer is a very scary diagnosis. And when people hear or think about cancer, they don't want to deal with that possibility, and so they just kind of push it aside. Well, the same is true for sexual trauma. Survivors don't really want to talk about it because it brings up all kinds of stuff within them, including shame. And other people don't want to talk about it because they don't want to face the reality that it happens, that it could happen to them, or maybe even did happen to them, but they're in denial about it. And this is not a judgment for anybody at all. It is just the reality that we live in. And as is the case with everything, the more that we can talk about it, the less stigma and shame there is. If we think about mental health in general, there's still stigma around mental health. but not nearly as much as there used to be, because people have started talking more openly about it. People have, it's slow progress, but progress nonetheless. People have started acknowledging that they see a therapist, that there's nothing wrong with seeing a therapist. As you know, I believe everybody should see a therapist at some point in their life. But that happens always because we talk about it. And I know that I have shared this before, but because this is specifically about eradicating the shame that we as survivors have experienced and lived with, I want to say it again to remind you there's absolutely nothing to be ashamed of. Not the fact that it happened, not the fact that you didn't tell anybody if you didn't, not the fact that you've struggled in whatever way you've struggled, not the fact that it might have happened more than once or by more than one person, as a child, as an adult. Nothing to feel ashamed of if you've even found yourself, and this is true for most survivors, we find ourselves in situations that are not necessarily very safe. And there are many reasons for this. And we find ourselves easily involved in those types of situations. And we often feel shame about that. We see that as a reason that we are, or even proof that we are in fact responsible for what happened. No. There's never anything to be ashamed of. The only shame that exists in any sort of abuse or interpersonal trauma, the only shame that exists is with the person who chose to do what they did, the person who abused or assaulted you. That's it. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. Doesn't matter if you put yourself in a situation that was potentially dangerous. No. We do that as humans. Sometimes it's kind of a carelessness, sometimes it's self-destructive, and sometimes it's just not paying attention. Does it matter? Absolutely not. Never the survivor's fault or responsibility. Never. Several years ago, I was writing different things about the message that I try to share in doing these videos and the things that I do. And what I ended up landing on was not our shame. And I've used that hashtag a lot, and I talk about it a lot. Not our shame, because we feel so much shame. As I said, for all of those things, we find so many reasons that we believe that we should be ashamed. But none of those are based in truth. Because no matter what, it is not our shame. And I carried so much shame. And an important thing about this is that very often we don't necessarily identify what we think or feel as shame. But it's there. I can honestly say that I have never met anybody who has been sexually abused or assaulted and not carried a tremendous amount of shame. I've met quite a few people who have said that they don't. But the more conversation we have, the more they recognize that shame is deep within them. But none of it, whether you're conscious of it or not, is something to be ashamed of. And for me, I don't think I would have defined what I felt or what I believed as shame specifically. Like I wouldn't have categorized it all as shame. Like, I think I probably had thoughts every once in a while of, I feel so ashamed or something like that, but not really recognizing the depth of shame, the destruction that shame caused. But unworthiness and shame go together. Feeling undeserving and shame go together. Not enough and shame go together. Feeling abandoned or rejected and shame, it goes together. Shame is incredibly destructive. And I really do believe it is probably about the most destructive thing that we experience as humans, but especially as survivors of sexual trauma. Because it keeps us, because we believe that we deserve that shame, it keeps us from sometimes even seeking support or help or healing. And we continue to hold on to the ideas that reinforce that shame. But never has it been ours. No matter what you say to yourself, and you've probably said it during these minutes that I've been on this video, you've probably said, but what about this? Or, but you don't know this. Or, well, yeah, but I did this. Or I didn't do that. No. And I can feel confident in saying this because in the over 20 years of doing this work, including my own experience, I've probably heard all the buts. And I say that very genuinely. I know I just kind of smiled about it because it's just kind of interesting how there's so much similarity there. But what we hold on to in that is so powerful, so destructive. And no matter what it is you hold on to that makes you believe that you have reason to be ashamed, I promise you, it's not. One of the biggest things that people feel shame around is the way that they've coped with it. And I've talked about this many times. In all reality, the fact that you were able to cope, whatever that might have looked like, that's not something to be ashamed of. That's incredible that we found ways without having to be intentional about it, but our mind and our body just knew how to cope. And especially as a child, or when you don't have any control over your life, being able to do that is incredibly powerful. That is strength. And feeling the shame in the ways that we cope is such an ongoing, destructive thing that keeps us from being able to really progress in healing oftentimes. So, whether it is a conversation within yourself, like noticing, what are you saying to yourself? How are those statements around shame or responsibility coming up for you? Do you buy into it, or are you able to stop it and say, no, I have nothing to be ashamed of. This is not my shame. I didn't do anything wrong. And I have had people say to me, oh no, I don't have any shame. I know it wasn't my fault. And that's good. And that's an important thing to be able to acknowledge. But what I've found quite often, particularly when that's a very quick response, is that cognitively people may know that it's not their fault. And therefore think, well, if I know it's not my fault, I don't have shame about it. But what can often happen is that, again, cognitively you can know. And you can know that for all kinds of reasons, including that anybody that you know who's had a similar experience, that you would never blame them for it. So on a cognitive level, you can fully know that and fully believe that. But because your beliefs about yourself and your shame starts very early on, what you know cognitively is not what you believe necessarily at your core. And that's part of the process of healing, is getting what you know to be integrated and become a part of what you know at your core. So regardless of whether you're aware of your shame or not, starting with your internal dialogue, how do you talk to yourself? Do you buy into the shame, or do you try to stop it and remind yourself that it isn't yours? And that takes practice. You have to keep doing it time and time and time again. Or when you are having a conversation with somebody else, or thinking about having a conversation with somebody else, do you stop yourself from saying anything, from even having a conversation, even if it's not sharing your own personal experience? It's okay to feel what you feel about it. It's okay to feel like you're not ready to talk about it with anybody else. Only you can know when that is right for you. And there's no judgment about when it happens or if it happens. But I do know that in order to heal, you have to be able to talk about it. And not just, I'm not saying you have to be able to talk about all the details of the abuse, because that's not it at all. It's about being able to have conversations about the reality of abuse, maybe about the reality that it happened, the ways that you've struggled with it, the impact that it's had on you, the shame that you feel about it. That is how we release the shame that we've held on to. And we cannot fully heal when we still believe, even if it's just a small part of us, if we still believe that we have something to be ashamed of. So think about that. Can you start with your internal dialogue? Is there a conversation that you can have with somebody? Maybe it's even a conversation that somebody else starts. Maybe they share something, and maybe you decide that today is the day that you engage in that conversation instead of trying to redirect it. And that's true whether you're a survivor or not. We often redirect when we're not comfortable with a conversation. So I would really love to hear from you. What did you notice coming up for you as you listened to this? So here's a little bit of a practice. What did you notice coming up for you as you listened? Was there anything that came up in your body? Was there any sort of immediate rebuttal, like a but? And just notice that. Maybe even do some journaling around it. Share in the comments. I would really love to hear from you when people can share things, their thoughts, their experiences, their reactions. It does begin a conversation. Even if it's just that somebody reads it or hears it and they begin to have a different dialogue in their own mind. Because it is time that we end the shame and the stigma of what it means to be a survivor of sexual abuse and assault. And I'm in. Are you ready to join me? Thanks so much for watching. If you found this video helpful, make sure to give it a thumbs up so other people can find it too. And make sure you subscribe if you haven't already, and click the little bell for notifications. Thanks so much for joining me. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.